Picture this. It's the tail end of a long, bone-tiring day. The sun's setting behind the smokestacks. Boots hit the porch with a heavy thud. And inside? A single pot bubbles on the stove, filling the room with a smell that says, "You've made it through another day." These were the dinners of America's hardest workers. Meals built not from luxury, but from leftovers, lard, and lessons learned the hard way. No measurements. No fancy ingredients. Just elbow grease, a cast iron pan, and whatever the pantry had left. From bubbling pepper pot stew to fried cornmeal mush, these weren't just meals, they were the backbone of American survival. And today, we're digging through time-worn cookbooks to rediscover 15 forgotten working man's dinners that once fed the factories, the farms, the rails, and the mines. Some will warm your soul. Others might raise an eyebrow. But every single one carries the taste of true grit. Let's step into the past and take a bite of history. They didn't have avocado toast. No sourdough starters. But what they did have was a hot skillet, some cornmeal, and a spoonful of bacon drippings. Welcome to the world of the hoe cake and hog grease combo, a southern staple that powered field hands, lumberjacks, and coal miners long before factory cafeterias ever existed. The name hoe cake goes all the way back to the 1700s, when slaves and poor farmers would mix cornmeal with water and salt, then fry the batter directly on the back of a hoe over an open flame in the fields. Yes, a real hoe. Later, when cast iron griddles made their way into kitchen hearths, the recipe didn't change much because it didn't need to. Simplicity was the secret. The real magic, though, was in the hog grease, bacon fat, saved in a tin can by the stove. This wasn't just cooking oil, this was flavor gold. That sizzle you hear when the batter hits the hot grease? That's the sound of survival. Thick, golden-edged hoe cakes were served with turnip greens, beans, or just on their own, sometimes dunked in molasses if dinner needed a touch of sweetness. Cheap. Filling. Fast. And packed with enough calories to send a man back into the field at sunrise. You won't find this on a brunch menu. But in old Southern cookbooks, and in the memories of anyone who grew up with a wood-burning stove, it's legendary. Today, we call it rustic. Back then, it was just dinner. It was the kind of dinner you could make with just 3 things: cornmeal, boiling water, and time. Johnny cakes, the original American flatbread, were the go-to meal for colonial farmers, sailors, and factory workers alike. No yeast, no eggs, no fancy flour. Just rough ground cornmeal mixed into a thick batter, slapped onto a hot griddle, and fried until the edges turned crisp and golden. This wasn't just food, it was foundation. The name Johnny cake is believed to come from journey cake because it traveled well. Sailors packed it in barrels, pioneers cooked it over open fires, and mothers made stacks of it to stretch $1 when meat ran out. But what made it dinner wasn't just the cake, it was what you poured on top. Molasses. Dark. Sticky. Sweet. It was cheaper than sugar, loaded with iron, and came in big tin jugs that lasted through the winter. Just a drizzle turned a dry corn cake into something comforting, even indulgent. For many working-class families, a plate of Johnny cakes with molasses was all there was after a long day in the fields or on the factory floor. It didn't look like much, but it filled the belly and stuck with you until morning. You didn't slice it. You didn't season it. You just ate it hot, right off the pan, usually with your hands, and maybe a mug of chicory coffee if you were lucky. Today, Johnny cakes have been gentrified, served in brunch cafes with maple syrup and whipped butter. But back then, they were survival in a skillet. And that sticky trail of molasses? That was the only sweetness many families tasted all week. It may sound like dessert, but in the working kitchens of early America, hasty pudding was anything but sweet. Born from British roots and reinvented by colonial cooks, hasty pudding started as a thick, boiled cornmeal mush, no sugar, no spice, just water, salt, and patience. Simple? Yes. But when meat was scarce and the family was hungry, this plain porridge turned into something heartier, hasty pudding stew. You'd start with a bubbling pot of cornmeal mush, slow stirred over the fire until it thickened like wet dough. Into that went whatever scraps you had, bits of salted pork, dried beans, leftover drippings, or even a boiled bone for flavor. This wasn't a meal you planned, it was a meal you built from necessity. It was cheap. It was filling. And if you were lucky, the smoky taste of pork fat or a handful of onions turned it from bland to bold. Families in the 1700s and 1800s often ate this 3 times a day. And when meat was truly gone, you could still pour molasses over the mush and call it supper. In old farmhouse kitchens, hasty pudding was served in tin bowls, scooped with a wooden spoon, and sometimes fried the next morning like a pancake. It stuck to your ribs. It warmed your bones. And it kept laborers on their feet. No recipe cards. No measurements. Just instinct and whatever the cupboard hadn't yet run out of. Modern cooks wouldn't recognize it. But for America's working poor, hasty pudding stew was proof that even the humblest ingredients could carry a family through hard times, one slow stir at a time. Long before canned soup lined every shelf, there was a bubbling pot in Philadelphia, filled with tripe, hot peppers, root vegetables, and centuries of survival. This was pepper pot stew. And it wasn't just food, it was fire in a bowl. The recipe came from the Caribbean, brought over by enslaved Africans and West Indian immigrants. But in the icy winters of the American colonies, it took on a new life. During the Revolutionary War, legend says George Washington's troops were freezing, starving, and on the brink of collapse at Valley Forge. Local women scraped together what little they had, cow tripe, onions, spices, and black pepper, and made this stew to warm the soldiers' bodies and spirits. From that moment on, pepper pot became known as the soup that won the war. For generations after, working-class families across the East Coast turned to this dish. It was cheap, spicy, and stretched for miles. You didn't need fancy cuts, just patience, a strong stomach, and a love of deep flavor. Tripe gave it that rich, earthy texture. Black pepper brought the heat. And sometimes, you'd toss in dumplings or old bread to soak up every drop. By the late 1800s, street vendors, mostly black women, sold steaming bowls of pepper pot from pushcarts, shouting, "Pepper pot! Smoking hot!" It was the soul of the city, served for a few pennies a ladle. Today, the stew has all but disappeared. You won't find it in restaurants. And few remember the taste. But in old cookbooks and oral histories, pepper pot stew lives on as a fiery reminder of how bold flavors and resilience fed a nation in its hungriest hours. No seasoning. No sauce. No softness. Just hardtack and salt pork, the original working man's ration, and a meal that could last through war, sea voyages, and harsh American winters. Hardtack was more survival tool than bread. Made with just flour, water, and a bit of salt, it was baked into dense, rock-hard squares that could last for years if stored right. Soldiers called it tooth dullers or sheet iron biscuits. And they weren't exaggerating, you needed strong teeth or a hammer just to break it. But paired with salt pork? That's when it became dinner. Salt pork was fat-heavy, heavily salted meat, usually from the belly or back, preserved in brine barrels. No refrigeration needed. It was cheap, stored forever, and packed enough fat and protein to fuel long hours of labor. For Civil War soldiers, whalers, and pioneers crossing the American frontier, this combo was often all they had. No vegetables. No fresh bread. Just a thick slab of pork fried in its own grease, and a chunk of hardtack softened in coffee or stew, if you had either. At sea, sailors soaked hardtack in rum or broth to make it edible. On the trail, they'd smash it with a rifle butt and fry it in bacon fat. Every bite was a test of endurance, but it kept men alive through unimaginable conditions. It wasn't delicious. It wasn't nourishing in the modern sense. But it was reliable. Today, it survives in museums, reenactments, and the footnotes of military cookbooks. But long ago, hardtack and salt pork was more than food, it was the lifeline for soldiers, sailors, and settlers. A reminder that for America's working class, dinner wasn't about flavor, it was about making it through another day. It came out of desperation. but ended up feeding an entire generation. During the Great Depression, when families lost jobs, savings, and sometimes even hope, dinner had to be simple, cheap, and filling. And that's when the poorman's meal found its place on the American stovetop. The ingredients? Just a few. Potatoes, onions, canned hot dogs, and if you were lucky, a little bit of oil or bacon fat to fry it all in. You'd slice the potatoes thin, let them sizzle in the skillet until golden and crisp around the edges. Add chopped onions for sweetness, and finally, throw in sliced hot dogs, because they were the cheapest meat you could get your hands on. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't fancy. But when a family of 6 needed to eat on just a few cents a day, this one-pan wonder could do the job. Some families added bell peppers or topped it with ketchup. Others stretched it further by mixing in cooked rice or leftover beans. And in the hardest times? Even the hot dogs were left out. Just fried potatoes and onions served hot and fast, with whatever you had. The poorman's meal wasn't just about flavor. It was about survival. It was about a mother feeding her kids with what little she had and still managing to bring warmth to the table. This dish became a quiet symbol of resilience across the 1930s. It kept people going through breadlines, dust storms, and factory shutdowns. And somehow, it still tasted like comfort. Today, we might call it retro or nostalgic. But back then, it was just dinner before the lights got cut off. Poorman's meal was the story of struggle, fried in a cast iron pan, and served with pride. Thick. Smoky. Filling. That was the promise of Brunswick stew, a legendary one-pot meal that kept lumberjacks, farmhands, and hunters going through long, bone-chilling days in the American South. But here's the twist. Nobody agrees where it came from. Some say it was first stirred in Brunswick County, Virginia in the early 1800s. Others swear it came from a hunting camp in Brunswick, Georgia. Wherever it started, one thing's for sure, it was never meant to be fancy. Early versions of the stew used whatever meat was on hand: squirrel, rabbit, opossum, or wild fowl, slow simmered with tomatoes, corn, and beans in a heavy iron kettle. And in lumber camps deep in the woods? This stew was king. Men worked from dawn to dusk felling trees, sawing logs, and hauling timber. When they finally returned to camp, they needed fuel. Real fuel. And Brunswick lumberjack stew delivered it in spades. The cook, often a fellow laborer, would throw together game meat, smoked pork if it was available, and anything else on hand. The longer it simmered, the better it got. Some pots cooked for days, constantly stirred and fed with scraps, turning into a thick, savory blend that could feed 20 men. It wasn't gourmet. It wasn't even consistent. But it was hearty, cheap, and made with care. By the late 19th century, the stew evolved into a community staple, served at church picnics, fundraisers, and logging camps across the South. Modern versions use chicken or beef. But those early bowls? They were pure survival, flavored by wood smoke, sweat, and the satisfaction of a day's labor. Brunswick lumberjack stew wasn't just a meal. It was a reward ladled from a black pot, steaming against the pine-scented air, and filling every belly around the fire. Before ribeye was trending. Before lamb racks sat neatly packaged in supermarket coolers. There were mutton chops, tough, gamey, and full of old-world flavor. Back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, mutton, or aged sheep meat, was the go-to protein for working-class families. It was cheaper than beef, easier to find than pork, and often sold by the chop, just enough for one laborer's plate. Pair it with boiled potatoes, affectionately called spuds, and you had a meal that was as plain as it was powerful. Mutton wasn't tender. It took time. Cooks would pan-fry the chops in lard or drippings, sometimes with nothing more than salt, pepper, and a bit of onion. If you had vinegar or mustard, even better. That helped cut the richness and mask the tougher texture. Meanwhile, the spuds simmered in a pot until soft, no butter, no cream. Just water and a dash of salt. Served plain, or mashed with whatever fat you had on hand. This wasn't Sunday roast material. This was Tuesday night after the mines. A coal-streaked collar, blistered hands, and a quiet plate of meat and potatoes. You'd find this meal in mill towns, rail camps, and tenement kitchens. It was filling. It was frugal. And for many, it was the closest thing to a luxury cut they'd ever taste. Farmhands ate it straight from the pan. Factory workers wrapped leftovers in tin foil to reheat over lunch fires. The smell of sizzling mutton fat was a working-class perfume, rich, greasy, and unforgettable. Today, mutton has all but vanished from American dinner tables. But once upon a time, mutton chops and boiled spuds were a badge of resilience, plain food for hard days, served hot, with no complaints. Because back then, flavor wasn't the goal. Getting full was. In the cold corners of rural America, where chickens outnumbered people and every meal had to stretch, there was one dish that brought warmth, comfort, and full bellies to the table: chicken and drop dumplings. This wasn't the rolled, flaky dumpling you see today. These were drop dumplings, soft, doughy spoonfuls made from flour, lard, and water, dropped directly into bubbling broth like little clouds of survival. Families didn't roast whole chickens. They stewed old laying hens, tougher birds past their prime, simmered slowly until the meat fell apart and flavored the broth with deep, rustic flavor. On wash day, planting day, or any day too poor for a second option, this was the dinner that held everything together. You'd start with whatever chicken you had: bones, skin, necks, backs. Add onions, maybe carrots or celery if the garden hadn't failed. And once the broth was thick and golden, the dumplings went in. No rolling pin, no shaping, just dropped in by spoon and steamed until tender. It was magic in a pot. One chicken fed a family of 6. No waste. No fuss. The dumplings soaked up every drop of broth. The chicken fell into shreds. And the kitchen smelled like something richer than money. This dish fed coal miners in West Virginia, cotton pickers in Alabama, and loggers in the Ozarks. It was passed down in tattered notebooks, scribbled on index cards, and whispered from mother to daughter across generations. You didn't need wealth. You just needed a pot, a bird, and a little flour. Chicken and drop dumplings wasn't just a recipe, it was a lifeline, served in deep bowls, steaming under kerosene light, while the wind howled outside and supper was all that stood between you and the cold. Before oysters became a luxury, they were working man's food. Back in the 1800s, oysters were plentiful, cheap, and hearty, harvested by the barrel along America's east coast. In dock towns and port cities, they were sold by the shovel and served by the ladle. And nowhere did they shine brighter than in a humble pot of oyster stew. This wasn't a creamy New England chowder. This was something thinner, simpler, and deeply soulful. You started with a pan of hot milk or water, a lump of butter, maybe a dash of salt or pepper. When the liquid steamed, in went the fresh oysters, liquor and all, cooked just long enough for the edges to curl. That was it. No potatoes. No thickener. No garnish. But for fishermen, shipbuilders, and rail workers, a hot bowl of oyster stew supper after a bitter winter shift meant one thing: you made it through another day. In coastal towns like Baltimore, New Haven, and Savannah, oyster carts were everywhere. For a few cents, you could get a bowl of stew and a slab of bread, served with a tin spoon and steam rising in the cold air. Even inland, tinned oysters became a pantry staple. Families would stretch one can into a stew that could feed 5. Some added crackers, or a splash of evaporated milk, but the heart of the dish was always the same: briny, butter-rich comfort. It was especially sacred on Christmas Eve, a tradition in many households, where oyster stew replaced meat for religious or frugal reasons. It became a holiday comfort wrapped in the scent of the sea. Today, we rarely see oysters without a price tag. But once upon a time, oyster stew supper was the poor man's feast, simple, soulful, and steaming with quiet dignity. Sundays in New England didn't smell like roast beef or gravy. They smelled like molasses, steam, and slow-cooked beans. This was the sacred tradition of Boston brown bread and baked beans, a working man's dinner that came straight from Puritan ovens and fed generations of laborers, dockhands, and mill workers. The bread wasn't baked in a pan. It was steamed. In old coffee cans or pudding molds, filled with a batter of cornmeal, rye flour, whole wheat, and molasses. No yeast. No eggs. Just baking soda, salt, and the dark sweetness that made every bite stick to your ribs. While the bread steamed for hours, the beans, usually navy or pea beans, were baked slowly in ceramic crocks. The sauce? A sticky, rich blend of molasses, pork fat, mustard, and a hint of onion. It wasn't just dinner. It was a ritual. For many working-class families, this was the only hot meal of the week. Saturday night, the beans went into the oven or hearth. By Sunday afternoon, they were bubbling, golden, and ready to serve with thick, moist slices of brown bread slathered with butter, if you had it. Mill towns like Lowell, Worcester, and Manchester thrived on this dish. It was cheap, filling, meatless, but protein-rich. And it carried the deep, molasses-sweet soul of old New England. You didn't need meat to feel full. You didn't need money to feel nourished. All you needed was a crock, a can, and a long Sunday afternoon. Boston brown bread and baked beans was the kind of meal that stuck with you through cold winters, long shifts, and 6-day work weeks. A taste of home that didn't require a dollar, just time, patience, and a spoon. Today, it's a curiosity. Back then, it was supper, pride, and tradition all in one steaming plate. It wasn't much to look at. Just a pale bowl of soft rice floating in warm milk. But to a struggling family, it meant survival with a spoon. This was rice and milk porridge, one of the quietest, cheapest, and most enduring dinners of old America. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't heavy. But it was filling, familiar, and made from the barest of essentials: rice, milk, salt, and sometimes a sprinkle of sugar or cinnamon, if the pantry allowed. This dish was a staple in immigrant households from Poland to Pennsylvania, from Scandinavia to the Appalachian Hills. It crossed cultures and languages, because nearly every working-class kitchen had access to some form of rice and milk from the back shed or neighborhood dairy. You didn't need meat. You didn't need spice. Just a pot, a ladle, and the will to make something out of almost nothing. Some families served it hot, fresh off the stove, thickened just enough to sit on the spoon. Others ate it cold the next day, spread on toast or reheated in lard for breakfast. During the Great Depression, this porridge fed millions. Mothers would stretch a single cup of rice into 4 bowls of supper. It was especially common in homes with children, easy to digest, warm on the belly, and comforting when there was nothing else to offer. For many, this dish wasn't just economical, it was emotional. A quiet symbol of care. A soft meal served when life was loud and cruel. Today, it might seem too plain to matter. But rice and milk porridge once stood between hunger and hope. It reminded people that dignity didn't come from richness, but from feeding your family with whatever you had left. Just rice. Just milk. And just enough to keep going. To modern eyes, it might look strange. But in working-class kitchens of the 19th and early 20th centuries, beef tongue was prized like gold. Why? Because it was cheap. It was filling. And when prepared right, it tasted like the most tender roast you'd ever had. Beef tongue with horseradish gravy was a staple among butchers, farm wives, and urban families scraping by on the forgotten cuts of meat. It started with a slow boil, 2, sometimes 3 hours, until the tongue turned buttery soft. The outer skin was peeled away, revealing rich, marbled meat that could be sliced thin and served hot or cold. Nothing fancy. No special tools. Just patience in a pot. The gravy? A sharp, creamy blend of beef drippings, flour, and fresh horseradish root, grated right at the table if you had it. It wasn't just there for flavor. That burning your nose? It woke you up, especially after a long shift in the cold. Tongue was considered offal, or variety meat, something wealthier households looked down on. But for laborers and housewives who knew how to stretch a dollar, it was a delicacy in disguise. Served with boiled potatoes, cabbage, or stale bread for dipping, this dish was often the centerpiece of Sunday dinners. Leftovers? Sliced thin for sandwiches the next day, if any remained. In Jewish delis, German kitchens, and southern boarding houses, tongue with horseradish was the kind of dish that didn't waste a thing and delivered bold flavor with humble roots. Today, you'll rarely see it outside specialty shops or traditional markets. But back then, beef tongue with horseradish gravy was a working man's roast, served hot, sliced thick, and never thrown away. Because in those days, if you paid for the cow, you used every part. Long before it became a once-a-year St. Patrick's Day tradition, corned beef and cabbage was everyday food for America's hardest-working immigrants. In the mid-1800s, as waves of Irish families fled famine and arrived in crowded tenements across New York, Boston, and Chicago, they brought with them a hunger for potatoes and pork. But pork was expensive in America. So they turned to something more affordable at the time, salt-cured beef brisket, what we now call corned beef. Paired with boiled cabbage, carrots, and potatoes, this one-pot meal became a lifeline. It was cheap to make, easy to stretch, and heavy enough to keep a laborer full well into the next day. You'd throw it all into a pot, often on Sunday morning, and let it simmer low and slow for hours while the family went to church. By the time you got home, the house was filled with the scent of seasoned meat and buttery vegetables. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't need to be. For dock workers, railroad men, housemaids, and street sweepers, this was the closest thing to a celebration they could afford. The saltiness of the corned beef balanced perfectly with the soft, wilted cabbage. The potatoes soaked up every ounce of brine. And if there was rye bread on the table, that was the cherry on top. It later became iconic on St. Patrick's Day, but make no mistake, corned beef and cabbage wasn't invented for parades. It was born from poverty, resourcefulness, and survival. This plate told a story. A story of struggle, resilience, and finding comfort in scraps. Today, it's a holiday dish. Back then, it was just Tuesday night, served in a chipped bowl, passed down with pride, and devoured in silence after a long day's work. It smelled strong. It tasted stronger. And for generations of poor farmers, factory workers, and fishermen, fried salt herring and cornbread was more than dinner, it was survival on a plate. Salted herring was once one of the cheapest proteins in America. Packed in brine, shipped in barrels, and sold by the slab, it lasted forever without refrigeration. You could find it in Appalachian general stores, coastal fish markets, and even inland mining towns where fresh meat was rare and pricey. To prepare it, folks soaked the fish overnight to draw out the salt. Then they'd fry it hard, skin crackling, bones softening until the flesh was rich, smoky, and golden. It wasn't delicate. It wasn't refined. But it was packed with flavor and fat, just what a body needed after a long day in the fields or down in the mines. Beside it, you'd always find a slice of griddle-baked cornbread, crisp-edged, hot, and often cooked in the same skillet to soak up the fish drippings. If you were lucky, maybe a side of collard greens or stewed tomatoes rounded out the plate. This meal was especially beloved in the American South. Black communities, tenant farmers, and sharecroppers made it a staple. It was cheap, dependable, and didn't require much more than fire and a cast iron pan. There were no silver forks, no napkins, just fingers, bread, and steam rising into the kitchen rafters. Fried herring wasn't polite, but it was powerful, deeply seasoned by struggle, ingenuity, and pride. You could smell it cooking from 2 porches away. And if your neighbor had a pot on, you'd hope there was a spare plate for you. Fried salt herring and cornbread supper was the kind of meal that lingered in the memory, bold, unapologetic, and rooted in the soil of working-class life. These weren't just recipes. They were lifelines stitched together from scraps, sweat, and survival. From salted herring on a cracked plate to dumplings dropped into chicken broth. These meals carried the weight of hard days, empty pockets, and full hearts. They were born in coal towns, lumber camps, railroad shanties, and tenement kitchens. Places where a cast iron skillet did more than cook, it kept families going when nothing else could. And though they vanished from today's dinner tables, their legacy still lingers in the yellowed pages of old cookbooks, in stories passed from grandmother to grandchild, and in the smell of fried onions that somehow still feels like home. These forgotten dinners weren't fancy. They weren't fast. But they were real. Real food. For real people. In real times of need. So before you throw out that stale bread, or scoff at a slab of salt pork, remember. Someone once made a feast from less and called it a blessing. And if these old dishes stirred something in you, a memory, a moment, or maybe just a hunger for history, then don't let this be the last time we eat like the past. Subscribe for more forgotten recipes, food stories, and flavors history almost left behind. Because here, every dish has a story worth telling.